I woke up in a care facility I'd never stepped into, with nurses telling me I'd been there for days. I wasn't sick or confused, but my phone, my home, and my freedom were gone. When I uncovered who put me there and why, I stayed silent and planned my move, because what I discovered next changed everything. Asterisk, asterisk. Before I tell you how I ended up here, and how I took control back, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps these stories reach the people who might need them most. A woman in pale blue scrubs walked past the open doorway without glancing in. "Excuse me," I called. My voice came out dry and used. She stopped, reversed a step, and smiled a practiced smile of someone trained to soothe without listening. "Oh, you're awake, Mr. Calder. How are you feeling?" "Where am I?" "Greenhaven Extended Care Center. You've been with us for 3 days now." 3 days. I pushed myself upright slowly, checking for pain, confusion, weakness. Nothing. My mind was clear. Too clear. "There's been a mistake," I said. "I don't belong here." She nodded sympathetically. "Your son handled the admission paperwork. He mentioned you might be confused at first." Confused? I was 66 years old, not 90, a retired structural engineer. I'd spent decades designing load systems that couldn't afford errors. Confusion was not something I suffered from lightly. "I need to call my son," I said. "Of course," she replied, already reaching for a phone. Not my phone, a plastic facility handset. When he answered, his voice was clipped, distracted. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something." "Why am I in a care facility?" I asked. Silence stretched too long. "We talked about this," he finally said. "You had another episode. The doctor said you needed monitoring." "What episode?" I demanded. "I feel fine. I want to go home." "You're not fine," he snapped. "You fell. You were confused. We'll talk later." The line went dead. My hand tightened around the phone. Something inside me went very still. When I asked for my belongings, the nurse returned with a clear plastic bag. Wallet, watch, wedding ring, no phone, no keys, no glasses. "Where's my phone?" "Your son took it," she said gently. "He said you were calling people and upsetting them." That was a lie. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. Over the next 2 days, I did exactly what they expected. I took the pills. I attended the group activities. I smiled. I listened. And I watched. Greenhaven wasn't cruel. It was clean, efficient, quietly hopeless. Most residents needed to be there. Wheelchairs lined the halls. Blank stares. Lives winding down. I did not belong among them. On the 3rd day, everything changed. My neighbor, Margaret, showed up unannounced. She was 71, sharp-tongued, and impossible to intimidate. The moment she saw me, her face hardened. "What on earth is going on?" she demanded. "Your son came with a moving truck last week. Said you'd had a stroke and were moving in with him." "A moving truck? They emptied your house," she continued. "Furniture, files, everything. I tried to call you, but he said visitors weren't allowed. My house, the one I built myself after my wife, Eleanor, died. The house where I raised my son alone. 40 years of work and memory. Margaret," I said quietly, "I need your help. Bring me a pen and paper. And don't tell him you were here." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be back tonight." That evening, I started writing. Dates, symptoms, the so-called dizzy spell. My son insisting I see a doctor I'd never met instead of my regular physician. A prescription I didn't remember taking. Then nothing. Margaret returned with a laptop. We checked the county property records together. The owner name on my house made my chest tighten. Transferred 2 weeks earlier. Sold under market value. Buyer, a holding company. My son's signature. My forged consent. "This is fraud," I said, calmly. "Precisely." Margaret studied me. "Are you sure you're thinking clearly?" "Test me," I said, "right now." She did. Numbers, dates, names, current events. I answered every question without hesitation. She closed the laptop. Then we're getting you out, and we're getting a lawyer. I didn't know it yet, but this was a moment everything shifted, because while my son thought he'd lock me away, I was already planning my next move. Margaret left just after evening rounds, slipping out with the same confidence she'd arrived with. I lay awake long after the lights dimmed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail I could remember. Engineers are trained to work backward from failure. Something had failed here, deliberately, and I needed to trace it. By morning, I had a plan. I continued to play the role they expected. I took the pills they handed me, though I let them dissolve slowly under my tongue and spat what I could into a tissue when no one was looking. The fog in my head began to lift almost immediately. That told me everything I needed to know about those medications. Late that afternoon, Margaret returned, this time with her grandson, Ethan. Ethan was in his early 30s, calm, observant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He introduced himself as a patient rights advocate at a regional hospital. "I'm not here as family," he said quietly. "I'm here as a professional." He asked permission before recording anything. I gave it. I told him everything, from the dizzy spell weeks earlier, to the unfamiliar doctor, to waking up in Greenhaven, to discover my house had been stripped and sold while I was sedated and isolated. Ethan didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Mr. Calder," he said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, and for what I can see it is, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is unlawful confinement tied to financial exploitation." Those words landed heavier than any accusation. "What happens now?" I asked. "First, we establish your cognitive baseline with an independent specialist," he said. "If you're competent, and I strongly believe you are, then everything that followed collapses. Even the house sale? Especially the house sale." 2 days later, a psychiatrist named Dr. Elaine Morse arrived. She was thorough in a way that felt almost surgical. Memory tests, pattern recognition, long conversations designed to expose confusion, if it existed. 3 hours later, she closed her notebook. "Mr. Calder," she said plainly, "you are cognitively intact. Your scores are exceptionally high for your age. You do not have dementia. You do not require assisted living." "Then how did I end up here?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Because someone wanted you here." That evening, Ethan made a call. The next morning, a man named Daniel Reeves walked into Greenhaven. Daniel specialized in cases involving older adults and financial abuse. His expression hardened as he read Dr. Morris's report. "This pattern is disturbingly familiar," he said. "Adult child under pressure, valuable property, a cooperative physician, quick isolation. What do we do?" I asked. "We move fast," he replied. "First, we get you discharged. Then we lock down your remaining assets. Then we go after whoever thought you were an easy target." Within 48 hours, Greenhaven released me with apologies. So rehearsed, they sounded automated. They claimed good faith reliance on medical documentation. Daniel assured me they'd be handled later. I can go home. I didn't have one anymore. Margaret insisted I stay with her. That night, my son finally called. "Dad," he said sharply, "the facility says you left against medical advice." "I left because I don't belong there," I replied, "and because an independent doctor confirmed I'm perfectly competent." "That's not what Dr. Hale said." "The doctor you paid." I corrected, "the one I'd never met." Silence. "Did you sell my house?" I asked. "It was necessary," he said. "Your care is expensive." I wasn't there even a month. "You could have been." "And the buyer?" I pressed. "The holding company?" Another pause. Longer this time. "It's complicated." "No," I said calmly. "It's theft." He hung up. 5 minutes later, his fiancée called from his phone. Her voice was smooth, controlled, confident. "Mr. Calder, let's be realistic," she said. "The paperwork is done. Fighting this will drain you. Courts believe doctors. They believe family, not confused old men." I smiled to myself. "That's where you're wrong," I said. They believe evidence." She hung up. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, and for the first time since waking up in that unfamiliar bed, I wasn't afraid anymore, because the people who thought they'd already won had no idea what I was about to prove. The 3 days before the hearing felt longer than the 3 days I'd spent locked inside Greenhaven. Time stretches when you're waiting for truth to collide with lies. Margaret's guest room became my command center. Legal pads covered the desk. Dates, names, prescriptions, phone records, everything laid out in careful order. Engineers don't guess. We verify. Daniel Reeves worked quickly. Too quickly for my son's comfort, as I would soon learn. On the second morning, Daniel returned with copies of documents he'd obtained through emergency court orders, medical records, admission forms, a power of attorney I had supposedly signed. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine at first glance. Close enough to fool a clerk. Close enough to pass if no one looked carefully. But I looked carefully. "The slant is wrong," I said. "I never cross my T like that, and I don't loop the D." Daniel nodded. "A handwriting expert will confirm it, but there's more." He slid another page across the table. A billing record from Dr. Hale, the unfamiliar physician my son had insisted I see. 15-minute consultation. Cash payment. $5,000. "Doctors don't diagnose dementia in 15 minutes, Daniel said flatly. "And they definitely don't take cash for it." The pattern was emerging fast now. That afternoon, Daniel arranged for a formal cognitive evaluation to be submitted directly to the court, not through any medical facility. Dr. Morris agreed to testify remotely if needed. Margaret's grandson, Ethan, prepared a sworn statement detailing my condition upon arrival and during my stay. By evening, the case file was thick enough to make a sound when set down. That's when my son showed up. He didn't knock. He rang the bell twice, sharply, like someone used to being obeyed. Margaret opened the door before I could stop her. He looked different, tired, defensive. His confidence cracked at the edges. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile. "We need to talk." "We're past talking," I replied, stepping into view. He glanced at Daniel, then back at me. "You don't understand what you're doing. This is going to get ugly." "It already is," I said. "You just assumed I wouldn't notice." He lowered his voice. "I was trying to protect you." "By drugging me? That's not." "By locking me in a facility? You were confused." "By selling my house? You weren't using it." Margaret crossed her arms. "You emptied it in one afternoon." He ignored her. "We needed the money," he snapped. "Do you know how expensive life is now? Weddings, houses, starting over." "So you decided to end mine," I said quietly. He flinched. Behind him, his fiancée lingered in the driveway, arms crossed, eyes calculating. She didn't step closer. She didn't need to. She was watching angles. Daniel stepped forward. "You should leave," he said calmly, "and you should contact your lawyer. This conversation is over." My son hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he straightened. "You think a judge is going to side with you?" he said. "Against your own son? With a doctor backing me?" I met his gaze without blinking. "Yes," I said, "because facts don't care who you are." He left without another word. The emergency hearing took place in a quiet courtroom with more gravity than drama. My son and his fiancée sat on one side with their attorney, young, polished, confident. Daniel and I sat on the other. The judge listened. That was a mistake they'd made all along. They assumed authority would replace evidence. It didn't. Daniel dismantled the timeline piece by piece. The rush diagnosis, the unexplained sedatives, the forged power of attorney, the below-market sale to a company linked directly to my son's fiancée. Dr. Morris testified calmly, professionally, devastatingly. "This man does not have dementia," she said. "He never did." The judge removed her glasses. "I'm issuing an immediate restraining order," she said. "Asset freeze on all related entities. And I'm referring this matter for criminal investigation." My son stood up. "Your Honor," I was just trying to help. Sit down, she said sharply. You were trying to profit. Outside the courtroom, his fiancée finally spoke to him. Not me. You said he wouldn't fight back, she hissed. You said he was confused. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to, because the game they thought was over had only just begun. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. Faster than my son expected, too. Once the court issued the restraining order and froze the assets tied to the shell companies, everything shifted. What had been a private family betrayal became a public legal problem. And public problems attract attention. Daniel called me the morning after the hearing. The district attorney has picked it up personally, he said. They don't like cases like this. Too many people get away with it. I sat at Margaret's kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I had forgotten to drink from. What happens next? Next, he replied. We stop reacting and start applying pressure. The first pressure point was a doctor. Dr. Hale was arrested quietly. No press, no spectacle, just a warrant, a search of his office, and a seizure of financial records. When the police found cash payments logged under vague labels, consulting, family coordination, his attorney advised him to cooperate. Within 48 hours, Daniel had the transcript of Hale's initial statement. He admitted everything. He'd never performed a full evaluation, never ordered imaging, never run cognitive testing. He relied entirely on my son's descriptions and narrative fed to him by the fiancée, who had framed everything as an urgent family intervention. The cash payment, he claimed, was for expedited services. Expedited fraud, Daniel said flatly. With Hale cooperating, the case against my son and his fiancée solidified quickly. Charges were drafted. Elder exploitation, fraud, conspiracy, false medical documentation, real estate deception. When my son was served, he called me from a number I didn't recognize. Dad, he said, voice shaking now, the arrogance finally gone. Please, this has gone too far. You drugged me, I said. You locked me away. You sold my home. I was influenced, he insisted. She said it was legal. She said this was how families handle these things. She said, I repeated, silence. Do you understand, I continued, that you didn't just take property? You took my autonomy, my dignity. You erased me. I didn't think. That's the problem, I said. You didn't. He started crying then. Real tears, not manipulation. I listened without interrupting. I'll do anything, he said. Just tell them not to file. I can't, I replied, and even if I could, I wouldn't. He hung up. The fiancée didn't call. She sent messages through lawyers instead. Threats wrapped in legal language. Warnings about delays, appeals, exhaustion. Daniel smiled when he read them. She's scared, he said. Predators panic when control slips. The civil case to recover my house was complex. The property had been moved through multiple LLCs, all connected, all designed to muddy ownership. But complexity doesn't equal protection, just delay. For months, Daniel traced paper trails, transfers, wire records, signatures. Every move the fiancée made was documented. She was good, but not flawless. People who believe they're smarter than everyone else eventually get sloppy. During discovery, something unexpected surfaced. She had done this before. 2 years earlier, in another state, an elderly widow had signed a power of attorney under suspicious circumstances. Her house was sold quickly. Proceeds disappeared. The family settled quietly to avoid publicity. Same pattern, same timing, same shell structures. The widow testified by video. I thought she was helping my nephew, the woman said, voice trembling. I didn't realize I was being erased. The criminal trial came first. I took the stand on the second day. I told the truth calmly. The dizzy spell. The unfamiliar doctor. Waking up institutionalized. Learning my life had been sold while I was sedated. My son's attorney tried to portray me as forgetful, stubborn, resistant to help. Dr. Morris dismantled that narrative in under 10 minutes. My cognitive scores were too high. My recall too precise. My timeline too consistent. Dr. Hale testified next. Eyes down, voice flat. He admitted to taking cash, to skipping protocols, to trusting the wrong people. My son took a plea deal. 2 years in prison, loss of professional license, 5 years probation, mandatory restitution, permanent restrictions on acting as power of attorney. Before sentencing, he asked to speak with me privately. We met in a small room with Daniel present. I know sorry is enough, he said. But I believe you, I said. And that makes this harder, not easier. Can we rebuild? He asked quietly. I looked at him. The child I'd raised alone, the man who betrayed me. I love you, I said. But love doesn't cancel consequences. And trust doesn't regenerate on demand. He nodded, tears falling freely now. The fiancée went to trial. She pleaded not guilty. She blamed my son, claimed ignorance, claimed good faith. The jury didn't believe her. Text messages destroyed her defense. Financial records sealed it. The previous victim ended it. Guilty on all counts. 5 years. When the verdict was read, she didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with calculation. Some people don't regret what they do. They regret being stopped. The civil case ended 8 months after I first woke up in that unfamiliar bed. The house was returned. $200,000 in damages transferred. When I walked to the front door again, the rooms were empty. Furniture gone. Photos gone. 40 years reduced to walls and floors. But the structure remained. So did I. Margaret helped me move back in. We went to estate sales, thrift stores. Slowly, deliberately, I rebuilt not what was lost, but what was possible. People asked if I'd been too harsh. My answer never changed. Loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you. I am 76 years old. I have my home. I have my dignity. And I have something else now. The certainty that when the moment came to choose silence or action, I chose action and I never looked back. Returning to the house was not a victory lap. It was an excavation. The first night, I slept on a borrowed mattress on the living room floor, surrounded by echo. Every sound carried. The refrigerator clicking on, the wind brushing against the siding, the distant hum of traffic I'd forgotten existed. The walls were bare, stripped of every photograph, every shelf, every mark that said a life had been lived here. My life. I didn't turn on many lights. I didn't need to. I walked the room slowly, touching door frames, corners, the banister I'd sanded smooth with my own hands decades earlier. Proof that I had been here before anyone tried to erase me. Margaret hovered in the background, pretending to organize boxes she brought from her garage. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Presence was enough. The next weeks were consumed by practicalities. Insurance, utilities, new locks, security cameras, a new phone number. Daniel insisted on all of it. People who lose control sometimes try to reclaim it, he warned, even when it's irrational. I understood that better than most. I furnished the house slowly, intentionally, nothing extravagant. A table sturdy enough to last, chairs that didn't creak, a bed that didn't remind me of a facility room. Each purchase felt like an assertion. I decide what belongs here now. During that time, letters arrived regularly, some from lawyers, some from the court, some from strangers who had followed the case after it quietly made local news. A few were from people who recognized themselves in my story. Older men, mostly, whose children had begun making suggestions about care and finances. I answered every one, not with advice, with encouragement. Document everything. Don't let anyone rush you. Your clarity is not negotiable. Helping them grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. It reminded me that what had happened to me wasn't rare. It was just usually hidden. My son began serving his sentence quietly. No appeals. No statements. Just silence. Part of me wondered if that silence was shame or relief. Another part accepted that it didn't matter. Understanding his motives wouldn't restore what he'd broken. The fiancé's conviction rippled outward. Investigators reopened older cases. Properties were re-examined. Names surfaced. Patterns confirmed. She hadn't been unlucky. She'd been systematic. I testified one final time, this time by affidavit, about her methods, her confidence, the way she spoke about older people as problems to be managed instead of humans to be respected. The district attorney thanked me personally. "You didn't just stop one crime," she said. "You disrupted a system." That mattered more to me than punishment ever could. Life slowly expanded beyond courtrooms and paperwork. Mornings became quiet rituals. Coffee at the same spot, by the window. The paper folded just so. A walk down the street where neighbors now greeted me with cautious warmth, unsure what to say but want to say something. Afternoons were for rebuilding, painting walls, repairing small things my son had ignored while stripping the place. Each nail driven felt like a reclaiming. Evenings were the hardest. That was when memory crept in uninvited. Eleanor in the kitchen, humming while she cooked, her laugh echoing off these same walls. The house remembered her even if everything else was gone. I let myself feel it. Grief doesn't weaken you if you stop fighting it. Months passed. The house transformed from empty shell to lived-in space again. Not the same life. A new one. Margaret remained my constant. She checked in daily, argued with me about politics, scolded me for skipping meals. She never treated me like someone fragile. She treated me like someone worth engaging. That mattered more than she knew. One afternoon, I received a letter from my son. No legal language. No requests. Just words. He wrote about prison. About time moving differently there. About realizing how easily he'd allowed himself to be convinced that control was care. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for understanding. I read it twice. Then I placed it in a drawer. Not because I rejected it, but because I wasn't ready to answer it. Readiness, I'd learned, could not be forced. As winter approached, I made a decision that surprised even me. I enrolled in a part-time community engineering program, not to teach, but to mentor young students, hungry minds, still idealistic enough to believe integrity mattered. Because it does. Standing in front of them, explaining not equations but responsibility, felt like closure of a different kind. A reminder that what I'd built over my life extended beyond property. One evening, after class, a student asked me why I bothered at my age. I smiled. Because experience only matters if it's passed on, I said. And because being alive doesn't stop when someone tries to end your relevance. By the time spring returned, the house felt like mine again. Not because it looked the same, it didn't, but because I had reclaimed the right to decide what came next. People still asked if I regretted not being softer, if I worried I'd lose my son forever. My answer stayed the same. Boundaries aren't cruelty, I said. They're clarity. I don't know if my son and I will ever rebuild what was lost. I don't know if time will soften what accountability hardened. But I do know this. I wake up every morning in a bed that is mine, under a roof that is mine, with a life that is mine. And no one gets to decide otherwise again. Not quietly, not legally, not ever. By the time summer returned, the house no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like a place where time had resumed. The floors no longer echoed when I walked across them. The furniture, modest, mismatched, deliberately chosen, absorbed sound, memory, and presence. Life doesn't snap back into place after something like this. It seeps in slowly until one day you realize you're no longer bracing yourself when you wake up. I stopped dreaming about Greenhaven. That alone felt like progress. The legal process, however, did not stop simply because I had reclaimed my home. Civil systems have momentum. Once started, they move forward whether you watch them or not. Restitution schedules arrived monthly. Updates from Daniel followed. Factual and unemotional. Funds recovered. Liens enforced. Accounts closed. Names added to registries that would make repeating the same scheme far more difficult for people who tried it on me. The district attorney asked if I would be willing to speak with a task force that had formed around elder financial exploitation. Not publicly. Not on record. Just to explain how it felt from the inside. What worked. What warning signs I wished I'd noticed sooner. I agreed. The meeting took place in a conference room with no windows and too much coffee. social workers, detectives, prosecutors, a few healthcare administrators who looked uncomfortable but attentive. I told them everything, not with anger, but with precision. How easy it was to isolate someone without violence. How quickly authority could be manufactured with paperwork and confidence. How dangerous it was when institutions assumed family equal safety. One of the younger detectives leaned forward. "What made the difference for you?" she asked. "My neighbor," I said without hesitation. "Someone who wasn't invested in my money. Someone who trusted my clarity more than my age." That answer stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Afterward, Daniel told me quietly that the task force was drafting new internal guidelines for care facilities and banks, additional checks when adult children suddenly appear with urgent paperwork. It wouldn't stop every case, but it might slow the next one down long enough for someone to ask the right question. That mattered. At home, life continued to expand in small ways. I planted a garden in the backyard, not because I needed vegetables, but because it gave me something to tend that wasn't broken. Tomatoes, herbs, a row of flowers Eleanor used to love. Watching things grow that didn't depend on manipulation or control felt restorative. Margaret took it upon herself to supervise my progress, offering unsolicited advice, and then arguing with me when I followed it incorrectly. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, glasses of iced tea sweating in the heat, discussing nothing of consequence and everything of importance. The news, the weather, the state of the world, who was wrong about what and why. She never once asked how I felt about my son. That restraint was a kindness. I thought about him anyway. Prison time does strange things of memory. It stretches regret and compresses justification. I wonder which one he was experiencing more of. Daniel said his plea deal required participation in counseling programs, financial ethics, decision-making, accountability. Whether those would stick was another matter. People change only when change costs less than staying the same. The letter he'd sent sat in my desk drawer. I didn't reread it. I didn't tear it up. It existed in a state of unresolved truth, and for now, that was enough. Late one afternoon, I received a call from a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself carefully, voice tight with nerves. Her father had recently been placed in assisted living under circumstances that suddenly felt off to her. She'd found my name mentioned in an online forum discussing elder exploitation cases. "I don't know if I'm overreacting," she said. "Everyone keeps telling me to trust my brother, but something feels wrong." I listened. I asked questions. I told her what to document, who to call, what not to sign. I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what she was allowed to question. A week later, she called back in tears, not of fear, but relief. An independent evaluation had stopped the property transfer just days before it would have gone through. The paperwork had been rushed. The diagnosis then. "You saved my father," she said. "No," I replied. "You did." That conversation marked a shift I hadn't anticipated. My experience was no longer just mine. It was a tool, one I could choose to use or not. And choosing to use it gave meaning to the months I'd spent feeling erased. I began keeping careful records of these conversations. Anonymous, discreet, patterns emerged quickly. The same tactics repeated. Different families, different states. Same urgency, same language, same appeal to what's best. Control dressed as concern. In August, Daniel invited me to lunch, not to discuss a case, just to talk. We sat in a quiet restaurant near the courthouse, the kind of place where people spoke in low tones and lingered over meals. "You know," he said midway through, "most people don't push back the way you did." "Most people are taught not to," I replied. He nodded. "That's changing. Slowly." I considered that. "Change doesn't come from comfort," I said. "It comes from interruption." He smiled. "You interrupted a lot." When autumn returned, it brought with it a letter I hadn't expected. It wasn't from my son. It was from Eleanor, or rather, from a storage company I'd forgotten existed. Among the items my son hadn't bothered to sell was a small rented unit containing boxes labeled in her handwriting. The company had tried to contact me months earlier, but the notices had gone to my old address. They were preparing to auction the contents. I drove there the next morning. Inside the unit were pieces of life I hadn't touched in years. Old notebooks, letters she'd written but never sent, photos from before her illness, small objects she'd kept for reasons only she understood. I sat on the concrete floor and went through them slowly. One notebook, in particular, caught my attention. Inside were pages of reflections, nothing dramatic, just thoughts, observations, worries about our son, notes about independence, dignity, aging. One line, underlined twice, stopped me cold. If I ever lose my voice, I hope someone believes I still have something worth saying. I closed the notebook carefully. That night, I placed it in the desk drawer beside my son's letter. Some things belong together, not to be resolved, but to be remembered. Winter approached again. The house held warmth better this year. The garden rested. The routine solidified. I no longer jumped at unexpected sounds. I no longer checked the locks twice before bed. I had reclaimed not just my property, but my sense of continuity. In December, Daniel called with one final update. "Your son will be eligible for early release next year," he said. "Good behavior." I thanked him. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time. Eligibility didn't equal readiness. For him, or for me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't eager. I was simply aware. As the year ended, I wrote in my journal, something I'd started during the legal chaos and kept out of habit. I used to believe safety came from trust. Now I know it comes from clarity. Trust may return someday. Clarity stays. I closed the book and turned off the light. Outside, the house stood solid and unchallenged. So, did I. The second winter, after everything happened, felt different from the first. The first had been about survival, keeping warm, staying alert, making sure nothing else could be taken from me. The second was quieter, steadier, built on something I hadn't had in a long time, certainty. I no longer woke up wondering what I'd missed while sleeping. That alone felt like freedom. Snow fell early that year, soft and unannounced. I watched it from the kitchen window with a mug in my hands, steam rising slowly, thinking about how strange it was that my life had narrowed and expanded at the same time. Fewer people, fewer obligations, fewer illusions, but more space inside my own head than I'd had in decades. Margaret called every morning like clockwork. "You alive?" she'd ask. Unfortunately, I'd answer, "Good, I'll see you later." Routine, I'd learned, was a form of trust. You showed up because you expected the other person to still be there. The calls from strangers continued, though less frequently now. Word spread quietly, never publicly, never loudly, but among advocacy circles, my case had become a reference point, not a headline, a warning. I didn't mind. If my experience could interrupt even one quiet theft disguised as care, then it had value beyond my own recovery. I remained careful not to let it consume me. There's a thin line between purpose and obsession. I refused to cross it. In January, Daniel invited me to observe a training session for new investigators assigned to elder exploitation cases. I sat in the back of the room, anonymous, listening as they discussed hypothetical scenarios that felt uncomfortably familiar. When the facilitator asked if anyone had questions, one young man raised his hand. What if the victim doesn't want to believe their family would do this? Silence followed. I spoke before I meant to. "Then you listen harder," I said, "because disbelief doesn't mean incapacity. It means betrayal hurts more than truth." Every head in the room turned toward me. The facilitator nodded slowly. Afterward, Daniel clapped me on the shoulder. "You're good at this," he said. "I'm careful," I replied. "There's a difference." At home, the house continued to evolve. I replaced the last of the borrowed furniture with pieces I chose deliberately. Nothing extravagant, nothing temporary. Objects chosen without apology feel different. They don't ask permission to exist. One afternoon, while reorganizing the study, I found an old drafting ruler buried in a box. It had belonged to Eleanor. She'd used it when helping our son with school projects, long before his life took the turn it did. I ran my fingers along the worn edge and realized how much of her patience had shaped the man he became, and how little of it had protected him from his own choices. Love is influence, not immunity. The letter from my son remained unopened since the last time I'd read it. Occasionally, I caught myself glancing at the drawer where it was kept, wondering what I would say if I ever responded. Every version I imagined felt incomplete, not because I lacked words, because I lacked trust. In February, something unexpected happened. I received a handwritten note from the widow who had testified against the fiancé in court. She wrote slowly, carefully, every letter deliberate. Because you spoke up, people believed me. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected. Belief, I realized, is contagious when it's backed by clarity. As spring approached, the snow receded and the garden demanded attention again. I worked the soil with renewed strength, kneeling without pain, breathing deeply. The body, like the mind, recovers when it's no longer under siege. Margaret joined me one afternoon, leaning on a rake she didn't need. "You look better," she said. "I feel quieter," I replied. She smiled. "That's better than happy." I agreed. The first real test of my resolve came in March. My son's attorney reached out, not directly, but through Daniel. A request, carefully worded, neutral, no pressure. My son wanted to meet. Daniel left the decision entirely to me. I didn't answer immediately. I took a walk instead. The long route, past the school, the park, the row of houses where life moved forward without awareness of my internal debate. I thought about Eleanor's notebook, about the lines she'd written about losing her voice. I thought about what voice meant, not volume, but presence. By the time I returned home, I knew my answer. I agreed to a meeting. On my terms. We met in a small conference room at Daniel's office. Neutral ground. No history embedded in the walls. My son looked older, thinner. The confidence he once wore so casually was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. He stood when I entered. "Dad," he said softly. I nodded and sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I don't even expect understanding. I needed to see you." I studied him carefully, not with anger, with accuracy. "Why?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because I finally understand what I did. Not legally, personally." I waited. "I thought I was managing a situation," he continued, "fixing a problem. I didn't see you as a person anymore. I saw you as a responsibility, and then as an obstacle. That admission mattered more than any apology. I don't trust you," I said calmly, "and I won't pretend that I do." He nodded, eyes down. "I know. I don't know if I ever will," I continued, "but that doesn't mean I wish you harm. It means I won't lie to make things easier." He looked up then. "Is there any path forward?" "There is," I said, "but it's not the one you want." I laid out boundaries clearly. No financial involvement. No legal authority. No private arrangements. Any relationship would be public, documented, slow, transparency, or nothing. He listened without interrupting. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "Thank you for meeting me. Thank you for telling the truth." I replied, even if it came late. We parted without embracing. That was intentional. Trust doesn't return in gestures. It returns in consistency, or not at all. After the meeting, I felt neither relief nor regret, just completion. A loop closed without collapsing into nostalgia or denial. Summer came early that year. The garden thrived. I hosted small gatherings again, neighbors, colleagues, a few people from the advocacy circles. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter returned without guilt. One evening, as I cleaned up after guests had left, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology. Not for restitution. Not for reconciliation. I had moved from reaction to authorship. That shift, subtle but absolute, changed everything. In late summer, Daniel called with a final update. My son had completed all required programs. His probation was proceeding without incident. The fiancé's appeals had been denied. The remaining shell companies dissolved. Loose ends tied. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I sat at my desk and reread Eleanor's notebook one last time. I paused at the line she'd underlined and added a note beneath it. In my own handwriting, your voice was heard. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the house stood quietly in the fading light, no longer a symbol of loss or violation, but of endurance. I had not been erased. I had been tested, and I had answered. By the time autumn returned for the third time since everything unraveled, I had stopped marking the seasons by what I'd lost. I marked them by what no longer frightened me. The house had settled into itself. Not restored, settled. The floors creaked in familiar places now. The kitchen smelled like coffee and fresh bread instead of antiseptic memories. The study held books again, not case files. Even the air felt different, as if it trusted me to stay. That trust mattered. I noticed it most in small moments. Leaving the door unlocked while I worked in the garden. Letting unknown numbers ring without a spike of tension. Falling asleep mid-sentence while reading and waking without the sense that something had been taken while I wasn't looking. Peace doesn't arrive loudly. It proves itself by what it removes. My relationship with my son existed now in a narrow, carefully defined space. Occasional updates through Daniel. Rare, neutral emails that contained facts rather than feelings. No requests. No pressure. No assumptions. It was not warm, but it was honest. For now, that was enough. The advocacy work continued, though I never thought of it that way. People still reached out, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through a friend of a friend. I learned to listen without absorbing their panic, to offer clarity without becoming responsible for outcomes. That boundary, so difficult at first, became second nature. One afternoon, a man about my age knocked on my door. He introduced himself as a former colleague of Eleanor's brother, someone who had heard my name mentioned at a community meeting. His daughter had started helping with his finances after a minor surgery. Things were moving quickly, too quickly. We sat at the kitchen table. I asked questions. I showed him what to look for. I watched understanding dawn in his eyes. Not fear, but resolve. I thought I was being paranoid, he said. No, I replied. You were being attentive. He left lighter than he arrived. So did I. Winter arrived again, sharper this year. Snow piled higher. Roads iced over. The house held steady. I found myself enjoying the isolation rather than enduring it. I cooked more, read more, thought less about the past and more about the shape of days. Margaret slipped on the ice one morning and fractured her wrist. Nothing serious, but enough to remind us both that time does not negotiate. I drove her to appointments, cooked her meals, sat with her when she grew restless. One evening, she studied me over her cast. You've changed, she said. So have you, I replied. She smiled. I mean for the better. I accepted the compliment without deflecting it. That was new. In February, I received a thin envelope from the corrections department. Official, impersonal. Inside was notice of my son's scheduled release later that year. No commentary. No expectations. I placed in the same drawer as the other letters. Some information is meant to be known, not acted upon. Spring returned gently. The garden bloomed early. I added a bench near the back fence and spent mornings there with my coffee, watching light move across the yard. It was on one of those mornings that I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer defining my life by resistance. For a long time, everything I did had been shaped by defense, protecting assets, enforcing boundaries, maintaining clarity against manipulation. Necessary, yes, but exhausting. Now, that vigilance had softened into awareness. I wasn't guarded. I was grounded. The difference mattered. In late April, Daniel invited me to dinner, not to discuss cases, just dinner. We talked about ordinary things, his children, my garden, a book we'd both read. At the end of the night, he raised his glass. To people who don't disappear quietly, he said. I smiled. To people who notice when someone tries to make them. Summer arrived warm and unhurried. I traveled briefly, Nothing ambitious, just places that felt open. I wrote Eleanor letters again, not out of grief, but companionship. I told her about the garden, about Margaret's stubborn recovery, about how the house felt lived in again. I didn't ask questions in those letters. I didn't need answers. One evening in August, I found myself cleaning out the desk drawer, the one that held everything unresolved. My son's first letter, Eleanor's notebook, court notices, the release notice. I didn't throw anything away. I organized it. Chronology replaced chaos. Memory placed beside meaning. Not to relive, but to acknowledge. That act felt like closing a door without locking it. As the days shortened, I noticed something else. I had stopped telling the story in my head. The version where I woke up trapped. The version where everything collapsed. The version where I fought back. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was complete. Stories lose power when they no longer need repeating. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, I sat on the porch with Margaret. The cicadas loud around us. She asked casually, "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know," I said, "but I've stopped needing to answer it." She nodded. "That's fair." The sky darkened. The house glowed behind us, steady and unthreatened. I went to bed that night with the window open, the sound of insects drifting in, and realized I wasn't waiting for the next chapter anymore. I was already living it. The notice of release arrived on a Monday morning. Folded once, official in tone and deliberately sparse. My son would be out within weeks. No request for contact. No instructions. Just information. I placed the letter on the kitchen table and let it sit there all day, moving around it as I went about my routine. Coffee, reading, a walk down the street. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed. That was new. Years ago, a letter like that would have hijacked my entire day. Now, it was just another fact. Important, yes, but not destabilizing. I'd learned that not everything significant needs an immediate emotional response. When the day ended, I slid the letter into the drawer with the others and closed it gently. The house was quiet that evening, but not empty. It held the hum of appliances, the ticking of the clock, the subtle sounds of a place that had accepted my presence as permanent again. I cooked dinner slowly, the way Eleanor used to, no rush, no shortcuts. I ate at the table instead of in front of the television. That, too, was new. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how little my life now depended on anticipation. I wasn't waiting for apologies. I wasn't bracing for confrontation. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I had already explained everything that mattered to the courts, to myself, to the people who needed to hear it. Whatever came next would arrive on its own terms. Margaret continued her daily calls, though she stopped asking if I was alive. She knew the answer now. She stopped by more often, sometimes bringing nothing at all, just conversation, and an opinion she expected me to challenge. We argued pleasantly about books, about the weather, about whether the world had always been this complicated, or if we'd just grown more aware of it. One afternoon, while we sat in the backyard watching the late summer light shift across the grass, she said, "You know, most people would have moved away after all that, started fresh somewhere else." "I did start fresh," I replied. "I just didn't change my address." She laughed. "Fair enough." The advocacy work tapered naturally, not because it wasn't needed, but because I had learned when to step back. I remained available, but no longer on constant alert. Others had taken up the work. People younger, louder, more public. That was how it should be. Movements don't survive by clinging to a single voice. They survive by multiplying. In early autumn, I received an email from one of the students I'd mentored in the community program. She'd been accepted into a competitive graduate track and wanted to thank me for teaching her how to question authority without becoming bitter. I reread that line several times. That, I realized, was a quiet reward of everything I'd endured. Not vindication, not punishment, transmission, the passing on of clarity instead of fear. As the release date approached, Daniel checked in, not as my attorney, but as someone who had walked the long road with me. "You don't owe anyone anything," he reminded me. "Not contact, not closure, not forgiveness, I know, I said, and I meant it. The day my son was released, I didn't mark on the calendar. I didn't wait by the phone. I spent the morning in the garden, pulling weeds, hands in the soil, grounding myself in something undeniably real. When I came inside, there was a voicemail waiting. It was from him. He didn't ask to meet. He didn't ask for help. He said he was out. He said he was safe. He said he hoped I was well. He said he understood if I didn't respond. I didn't delete the message. I didn't return the call. Not because I was punishing him, but because I was listening to myself. And myself said, not yet. That evening, I wrote in my journal, something I still did occasionally, not to process pain anymore, but to record perspective. I once thought strength meant endurance. Then I thought it meant resistance. Now I know it means authorship. Authorship of my days, my boundaries, my future. When to return softly that year. The house held warmth easily. The routines held steady. I traveled briefly again, places that felt open rather than distracting. I wrote Eleanor letters less often now, not because she felt farther away, but because her presence had settled into something constant. She didn't need updates. She had shaped the man who stood here now. On what would have been our anniversary, I visited her grave early in the morning. I brought flowers. I sat. I spoke, not out of grief, but recognition. You were right, I said quietly, about boundaries, about dignity, about believing your own voice. The wind moved gently through the trees. No answers came. None were required. Driving home, I passed a house where I'd woken up one morning not knowing where I was. The care facility looked the same from the outside, neutral, orderly, unremarkable. I felt no anger, just clarity. Systems don't change because one person suffers. They change because someone refuses to disappear quietly. Back home, I made a decision that surprised me only because it felt so natural. I drafted a letter not to my son, but to myself. A statement of principles. Clear, calm, unapologetic. I placed it in the drawer, last in the stack. The drawer closed without resistance. Life, I'd learned, doesn't return what was taken. It offers something else instead. The chance to decide who you are after survival. I chose to be someone who noticed. Someone who questioned urgency. Someone who trusted clarity over sentiment and boundaries over guilt. I am not bitter. I am not hardened. I am not waiting. I wake up in a bed that is mine. In a house that stands because I reclaimed it. In a life that belongs to me. Fully, deliberately, and without apology. And that is not a recovery. That is a victory. Before you leave, do one small thing. Subscribe to the channel and share where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like this reach the right people because viewers like you help them travel farther.